Hello there! Welcome to Skeleton Key Productions. I'm Crime Graves Kokon. Let's get into the video. Today's video, we're going to be asking the very important question of what are the top 10 countries that could leave the EU. Now, this video is not going to be looking at what countries are most likely to leave. It's not looking at opinion polls, not looking at, how strong the Eurosceptic parties are in those countries. It's not saying any of those things. In this video, we're just going to be looking at the pure facts in terms of economics. We're going to have money talking today because money talks. So that's what we're going to be looking at. There'll be 4 different categories. So one is going to be trade. The other one is going to be whether the countries are net contributors to the EU budget. Third one is going to be who were net recipients and who were net donors of the Corona Recovery Fund from this year. And the fourth one is going to be which countries are part of the Eurozone. With this, we're going to look through some of the countries. So going category by category, we're going to look first of all at trade. Now, the UK was in a quite unique position within the EU in that it hit it didn't hit the third one because obviously Corona wasn't about at that point, but it hits the other criteria. So Britain was not in the Euro. It was for every single year that it had been a member, it was a net contributor to the EU budget. And on top of that, especially in the later years of our relationship, it was a thing where we did most of our trade with countries outside of the EU. Now that we're leaving, this changes the dynamic in Europe quite considerably. The stats that I'm going to read you now with regard to trade are with Britain leaving already been factored in. So this is the percentage of trade that countries do outside of the bloc in the absence of the UK. So our closest neighbour, the Republic of Ireland, comes in at number 1 with regard to this category. Its largest trading partner is the United States. Taken as a single country is the United States. When we add Britain, which also a major trading partner, so Britain and America and all the other countries in the world outside the EU, there's now 27 countries in the EU, there's about 200 countries in the world. So looking at just those figures, 63% of Ireland's trade, this is the total sum of the imports and exports combined, 63% of trade will be done with countries outside of the EU. Big part of why countries joined the EU is to have tariff-free exchange of goods and services and stuff within the common market. This allows people from Britain and from other places in the EU to trade without tariffs. So tariffs are taxes on imports. So if I sell something to someone in Germany, the German government's not going to put a tax on that because it's still within the EU. However, obviously when we leave, Germany could have tariffs on our goods, and we could also put tariffs on their goods, vice versa. Free trade does tend to be better overall, but still, countries, for various different reasons, will employ protectionist policies, either to protect their own business or just to give a little bit of clout on at the bargaining table as such. 63% of Ireland's trade will be done with countries outside the EU, and therefore, if we're going to make the argument on trade alone, once we've left, Ireland is in the strongest position to leave the bloc and then strike up trade deals with countries, the other 63% of its trade. Now, the EU obviously does do a lot of trade with countries outside the bloc as well. It has many different trade agreements, so it does cover quite an extent of that. However, the EU does not have countries with quite a lot of places, with America, with China, etc., etc. It's not to say that Ireland, if it were to leave, would end up doing this for various different reasons, to do with food standards and environmental standards, etc., etc., workers' rights. There's a whole heap of things that go into trade deals which are a lot more to do with politics than they are to do with basic economics. So Ireland is top place with that. Now we look at second place and we see that Cyprus. Cyprus being on the periphery, it's quite simple to see with what the stats I'm going to be discussing here. It tends to be the countries which are more on the periphery of the continent that tend to have most trade with places outside, although not exclusively, but by and large. Cyprus comes in at 59%, and obviously quite a lot of its trade is done with places like Turkey, other places in the Middle East, etc., etc. Quite a lot of its trade is not necessarily done through the EU. So again, Cyprus, which joined relatively late in the game. If it wanted to, on those grounds, we're not going to talk about anything else right this second. On trading grounds, it makes most sense for Cyprus to leave. Now we're starting to get further and further down the list. So at 49%, we have the nation of Italy. Italy, being one of the founding members of the EU, it's one of the original founding six. The Treaty of Rome, the founding document which founded the EU, was obviously in the Italian capital. Now, one would expect Italy to be very tied up within the project. However, 49% of its trade after Brexit will actually be with countries outside the EU. So that means that 51% will be with countries inside of the remaining EU. However, it's something to bear in mind that actually a substantial chunk of its trade is still going to be done with countries outside of it. Next, we're going to go on to France. France comes in at 48%. France is one of the founding members. It's pretty much the same thing that you could say with Italy, except that France, especially in the early days of the Union, this is before Germany reunified. Up until that point, France was the kind of dominant power. France was the one that had to kind of be dealt with and stuff, yeah. And what France wanted is pretty much what the bloc ended up wanting, because France held quite a lot of sway. If you look at especially to do with the common agricultural policy, the common fishery policy, etc., etc., quite a lot of the very most protectionist elements of the bloc, and in many ways some of the most federalist minded tend to come from France. Actually, one of the founding fathers of the European project as such, he was a Frenchman. France has a lot of ties with the EU, so it's unlikely to, but at the same time, if it wanted to, there's still 48% of its trade which will be done with countries outside the EU. Now we're starting to get onto a whole bunch of countries which are at 47%. So we have Denmark, Greece, Sweden, and we have the most powerful country in the EU, Germany. Germany is right at the heart of the EU. It's the seat of the Eurobank. It's the biggest net contributor by far. Even when Britain was in it, Britain came second place to Germany. Germany funds a lot of the project, and it does certainly serve Germany's national interest in many regards to have United States of Europe, because if one looks at it, Germany, obviously geographically speaking, right in the heart of the continent, and it's been the plan for many German foreign policy thinkers to have a kind of unified Europe with Germany at the center of it pretty much for the last 100 years. Obviously in various different forms and with very, very different intentions from what it was before, but still each country has its own geopolitical interests, and so that's something to take in consideration. That while German economy is very, very powerful, and while it trades a lot with countries outside the bloc in its own right, it still is a thing where it is very tied to the EU. So it could leave if it wanted to, and we'll get on to a bit more of that in a bit, but it's just something to bear in mind. Now we're starting to get on some of the other countries. So we have Malta at 46%, and we have Finland and Lithuania at 45%. These countries, again, tend to be quite peripheral. These countries joined relatively late in the game, not necessarily a big Eurosceptic presence within these countries. In the case of Malta, they do receive quite a lot from the EU budget, which we'll get onto in a bit, but it is something to bear in mind that actually, again, quite a substantial part of their trade done with it. Now, when we look at some of the other countries, ones that make a lot of the headlines with regard to being very hostile to the EU in many regards, going against some of their foreign policy, their courts coming up to loggerhead with the EU because of laws being applied domestically that the EU is some would say interfering with. Quite controversial laws that have been passed in places like Poland and Hungary. But on this list, with regard to these kind of statistics, we have Poland with 26% of its trade done with countries outside the EU, and Hungary, which is 21%. So 79% of Hungary's trade is done with countries inside the EU, and 74% of Poland's is done with countries inside the EU. And this is after Britain's really left, so never mind what it was when we were still members. When we actually think about it, it's a thing where these countries, as much as they might complain, at the end of the day, a significant amount of their trade is done with countries inside the bloc, and so from a trading standpoint, it doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense for them to leave. Assuming they were able to strike up free trade deals afterwards, maybe, but if the EU didn't give them a free trade deal, it would quite significantly harm their economy. And then also we have countries which again have been in the news a lot this year, Holland and Austria. Holland, Austria, Sweden and Denmark. These countries have been part of what's known as the Frugal Four in Europe. There are pushes for some level of Euroscepticism within these countries. However, when we look at Austria and Holland, 35% of Holland's trade is done with countries outside the EU. And for Austria, it's 33%. Holland and Austria are very, very dependent. Austria joined in 1995. Holland is one of the founding members, and as much as in both regards there might be politically strong Eurosceptic strain, at the end of the day, it's still a situation where in trading terms they don't have as much clout as they might pretend that they do. Now, for the sake of expediency, within this, we are going to predominantly be looking at the list we've already listed out. Of course, there are many other countries within the EU, but it's the thing of I basically looked at all the countries which are within have at the very least 45% of their trade done outside the EU, and also any countries which have been in the news for Europe with strong Euroscepticism. So for instance, Spain doesn't make this list because Spain is quite dependent on trade with the EU, and on top of that, it's very, very pro being part of the Union, in spite of many of the economic crises that have come with the euro, but we'll discuss that in a little bit. And the same with Portugal, the same with quite a lot of other countries, Belgium, which is heavily dependent on the EU, Luxembourg, etc. Quite a lot of these countries is a thing where they've not made the news for being particularly Eurosceptic, and it's a thing where they're heavily dependent on trade. So on multiple different fronts, even if there were to be strong Eurosceptic movement from there, on trading terms, it wouldn't really make sense for them to do it. So now we're going to look at net contributors from the list that we just listed out. In terms of net contributors, the following countries are net contributors: Ireland, Cyprus, Italy, France, Denmark, Sweden, Germany, Malta, Finland, Holland, and Austria. All those countries are net contributors. This means that they put more into the EU budget than they do get back in terms of subsidies and all the rest. So Britain put in about £20 billion a year, then got a chunk back from the rebate, then got a chunk back from subsidies, and so it came to a net figure of about £8 billion a year being sent to the EU. We were the second largest contributor. Germany was at 12 billion, and many of the countries that we listed there, they gave a few billion here and there as a net. That means that quite a lot of the other countries that didn't mention just then, such as Poland and many other places, they actually receive more from the EU than they do actually give. In monetary terms, these countries are being subsidised by the EU. So many of the countries in Eastern Europe, some of the countries in Southern Europe, such as Greece, as much as they might complain about the EU, at the end of the day, they receive more in pure money terms from the EU than they actually do. So if they were to leave, they would be receiving less money than they currently do. These figures are probably subject to change in the coming years. First of all, because of obviously the pandemic we're all facing now has really upended the cart. It's not clear as of yet which countries are going to be significantly poorer and which ones are going to be doing relatively right. Most of the countries, for instance, that have very high death rates tend to be in Western Europe, whereas countries in Eastern Europe tend to not be so much. That's probably to do with tourism and many other things. Relatively speaking, weathered the storm a little bit better than their counterparts in the West, and so as a result, we might end up seeing there being a swap around of what countries are net contributors and which ones are net recipients. But as the figures are so far, that's what it is. Now we have to bear in mind this COVID recovery fund. Again, many of the countries in particularly the north of Europe were very hostile to giving this extra money, this extra €500 billion euros worth of funding to these different economies to pick them up a little bit. Some of the countries were quite willing to give this money, such as Germany. However, there were many countries which were very, very hostile to it, and we've already mentioned the Frugal Four. These countries in particular were countries in the north of Europe who said, actually, we're a bit fed up with having to subsidise the south. And this is the thing, when we talk about European unity, it looks very good on a map, and it sounds very nice in books and songs, etc., etc. At the same time, when you get past the slogans of it, what you have to recognise is that at the end of the day, the different competing countries within the EU have had hundreds of years worth of history. Those countries, most defining moments, have been in conflict with other countries. As soon as the feces hits the fan as such, right, it's a thing where a lot of these old enmities, a lot of these old bitternesses start to come to the surface. And also as well, countries in Western Europe are quite bitter at Eastern Europe for having a more authoritarian streak. Countries in Eastern Europe tend to look at the West as more decadent and like uber liberal. Countries in Northern Europe are sick of like countries in Southern Europe like kind of constantly needing bailouts and not being very sensible with their money, getting into loads of debt. And then the countries in Southern Europe are going, oh, look at all you stingy like Northerners who are not like kind of giving us any money, you're not helping us, what we meant to be doing, yeah, we're broke. Within the EU itself, you have 27 competing interests, and then within those countries you have competing interests. The whole thing is a lot more complicated than simply talking about a European Union. Just the United States is not just a blanket thing, and how they had to go through like hundreds of years to try and get to like to form a more perfect union, and how different states compete with each other, and especially in the past they were a lot more hostile to each other, i.e. the Civil War being the perfect example of this. The European Union, the Treaty of Rome, started in, it happened in 1957, and the EU, as its name came, wasn't until 1992 with the Maastricht Treaty. So with all that being said, it's something to really bear in mind. Now, when we're looking at these, the countries which gave more to the COVID recovery than what they received back, it's the following list: Denmark, Sweden, Germany, Finland, Holland, Austria, and interestingly, Poland, because Poland has large levels of growth since it joined the EU back in 2004, partly to do with remittances. So a lot of Polish migrants have gone to places like Germany and Britain and have sent money back, and this has helped boost their economy. Also, the elimination of tariffs between Poland and countries in the EU. Polish industry is easier to export like to the continent, and also vice versa. So there's a lot more trade like kind of going back and forth and stuff since Poland has joined. It's helped to lift this former Warsaw Pact country, this former communist country, and so the gap has now got to the point where it's kind of closing, and so places like Poland are now doing better in many ways than a lot of countries in Southern Europe, such as Greece. As a result, Poland now is going, hold on, you're giving us all this pressure with regard to our internal politics, and on top of that, you're making us have to subsidise things. Yeah, there's more tensions, and as years go on, and as the game changes again, we'll see how the chips fall. And then finally, we're going to be looking at which countries do have the euro and which countries do not have the euro. So in terms of countries which do not have the euro, from this list, we have Denmark, Sweden, Poland, we have Hungary. Now, all the other countries on that list have the euro. So that means that they're tied to the Eurozone, so they don't have their own currency, which means that if they are tied to the European Central Bank, which is in Frankfurt, they can't make their own monetary policy. This is a big problem with the euro crisis from about 10 years ago. Countries such as Greece, which normally would devalue their currency in order to make imports cheaper, or is it exports? I'm not like the greatest at economics, especially when it comes to like currency and like really statistical kind of number, things like that. I understand general principles with regard to economics, I'm going to talk about that, but in terms of the nitty gritty of it, it's a bit lost on me. That being said, normally they would devalue their currency, and that would like help to recover economic growth. However, them being tied to the European Central Bank, which means that the euro doesn't change much because it follows very much the kind of German model. The Germans, when they had the Deutsche Bank, which was their currency beforehand, used to be a very, very stable currency, because the Germans, from their experience from the period post World War One with hyperinflation, they've always been very afraid of inflation, and so they keep inflation at a very low rate. As a result, this serves the interest of countries like Germany and many of the other northern countries, which their economies are better suited for this. However, a lot of the southern European countries, which tend to be quite poorer, they didn't benefit as much, and that's why you've had a lingering recession in some places, in some cases like a depression on a technical basis, because it's lasted so long. Greece hasn't really recovered still, and actually, if you look at Italy and Greece in particular, since it joined the euro, their GDP per capita hasn't actually grown in all that time. It actually has shrunken. Being that part of the euro hasn't benefited Greece and Italy in particular, and this is probably why you're seeing such strong Eurosceptic strains within them. Now, before we reveal the top 10, I have to just explain something. So, the reason why the background is all very, very different is because basically I am a COVID refugee. Someone in my house went to someone's house, they knew that person had COVID, they went to go and drop something at a house, and then decided to stay at that person's house. for 5 hours. When they said that they were coming back, I was like, I've got things to do, and so I don't want to have to self-isolate. So at least for the temporary being, I am moving in with a friend, and so I'm staying at a friend's house. So that's why the background's a bit different. So enough of the sob story, but if you want to help me, if you want to help the channel, please give £2 a month. Give £2 a month to a starving YouTuber. I'm homeless. I have no home. I'm cold. I've been wearing this suit all week. Please, please, please hit the like button. And if you have any friends, please share them and give some to me as well. I could really use some friends. Please. Please. So now, getting on to the top 10. So, starting with number 10, in terms of countries which we think are least likely to. So, starting off with 10, I think it is Austria. The reason being is because while it does have a Eurosceptic strain, it's obviously been part of the Frugal Four. In terms of trade, I think that they're very dependent on the EU. And so at this point, if they had stayed in EFTA, as they had been before, with countries like Switzerland, etc., I think that would have been better. Maybe if they left but stayed in EFTA, it could probably work out. But if you're talking, for all these scenarios, we're talking about a full like Brexit style thing. We're talking about like they leave like lock, stock and barrel. They're not negotiating at all. They're not like keeping bits of it. They're not like, we're talking about a full clean break in all these scenarios. If that being the case, Austria is pretty low down the list. Next country, again, for very similar reasons, is Holland. Yeah, Holland, again, trades far too much with the EU. And while it might grumble, and while it might have kind of a Eurosceptic strain in parts, it's a thing where realistically Holland's not going to go anywhere anytime soon, at least to the extent that Britain has. It's not going to do a full Brexit, well, Nexit. The next country is Finland, which again makes the list for a very similar reason. Again, Finland joined in 1985, I believe, for the same reasons as the other two. It's too tied up with like within the bloc for it to just fully like kind of exit. The next country is Cyprus, because while Cyprus does trade a lot with countries outside the EU, and so in those terms it makes like it's a beneficial sense. At the same time, Cyprus received a lot of money, both from the COVID thing and also just as net recipients, and they got the euro, so that's another thing as well. Many of these countries that are really listed, actually all the countries that are listed do have the euro. Like that's another like thing like kind of that goes against it. Number 6 is actually France, because again France does have a bit of a stronger argument because it does trade so much with countries outside the EU. However, it being one of the founding members, it's very tied up within the project. But the thing is, this is where it gets interesting, because it's a net contributor to the fund. It obviously is within the Eurozone. But interestingly, France was actually a net recipient of the COVID recipient fund because of how hard France was hit. And also, like kind of this goes into number 5, which is Italy, for very similar reasons. France and Italy are very similar. They are in a position where they could leave if they wanted to, but they are quite dependent on the EU in many regards, because the real purse holders as such are Germany, and so it's a thing where actually they might want to leave. There might be a strong argument for leaving. They are obviously very powerful economies and very powerful countries, very influential countries. So if either of those two left, the whole like future of the project would very much come under question. Britain leaving, if a country was going to leave, it was always going to be Britain, an island nation. We've always like opted out of like every single thing. Britain's a very unique case. So Britain leaving, people kind of like took that as like, okay, fine, whatever. But if France or Italy leave, watch out, because the future of the EU then really comes into question. Number 4 is the Republic of Ireland. So as we've said before, Ireland in terms of trade is the best positioned after Brexit to be able to like actually have like a full exit. I can't even like exit, whatever. Like I can't even pronounce it. Ireland could leave if we want to. It's not in the Schengen zone, and actually its economy has been doing very well. However, there's a strong pro-Europeanism within Ireland. Like a lot of people in Ireland associate the economic growth of the 80s and 90s, where they became the Celtic tiger. They associate that with their European membership. So yes, like Ireland probably could. It's in a good position. It has ties to America and Britain and many other places, and obviously it speaks English as well, which is another plus. But it's part of the Euro. It's less likely, I think. I think Ireland's one of the least likely countries on this list to actually leave. Number 3 is, of course, Germany, which is, you know, the big daddy, the one that actually kind of controls the purse strings. But it's in the euro, so that's like what doesn't have it higher up on the list, because obviously if it wanted to, it could go back to the Deutschmark. I think it could, probably quite easily could. At the same time, the majority of its trade is still done within the EU, even if a large segment of it is still done outside the EU. It doesn't really serve Germany's national interest for it to leave. Could leave if it wanted to. If it wanted to scale down, it's like kind of its international ambitions, but it wanting to be a global power in the world, and it being in a position where it could be a global power and where it's like very much respected and very central to Europe, it makes sense from a German perspective for them to stay in the bloc. So now we're going to look at the top two, in my opinion. Both of them are Scandinavian countries, and both of them do not have the euro, and both of them are net contributors to the EU fund, and both of them put in more money into the COVID recovery fund than they got back, and that is Denmark and Sweden. Denmark joined the same year as Britain did in 1973. Sweden joined in 1995. Both countries have been quite hostile to it. I would probably go more with Denmark, just because Denmark, while it has been in there longer, they have more opt-outs than Sweden. Also as well, Denmark obviously trades slightly more with countries outside of the EU than Sweden does, and so it's in a slightly better position, but I think both countries are very similar in their argument. So yes, so that's my top 10 list of countries with the best economic arguments. Yes, there's probably some other things in there as well, other things I forgot to mention, such as fisheries, such as like agriculture, but to be honest, I'd be here all day talking about all the intricacies about this. With regard to all of this, I'm not an expert. I've literally just looked at some of the statistics. None of it is based on opinion polls. Opinion polls in most of these places show not just a desire like to remain in the EU, but in some cases for there to be like ever closer union, for there to be a European army, etc., etc. So I'm not saying that any of these countries are likely. I'm not going to say that straight after Brexit these countries are lining up to, but I'm saying that if they ever decided to, they are in like the best position, economically speaking, to leave, because a big part of the argument with regard to like why Britain should remain in the EU was tied to economics. So the arguments for leave were more like kind of cultural. It was more to do with like kind of patriotism. It was more to do with the feeling of like independence and of self-control and, you know, money, law and borders, etc. The big argument that the Remainers were saying was with regard to saying that actually it's to do with the economy, the trade will suffer, etc., etc. But even with all that being said, it was a situation where Britain still has the best kind of cards to play of any nation that was in the bloc or is in the bloc. If they wanted to leave, then Britain was always that wild card that could leave if it wanted to. But these other countries are a lot more tied to the EU. Denmark and Sweden probably could get away with it in a similar kind of way and maybe form, like, I don't know, a new Hanseatic League, but which has been floated. With Britain gone, I think that the champion for like a lot of hostility towards further integration, hostility towards a bigger budget, etc., which a lot of the Scandinavian countries were very sceptical of. Now that Britain's out, they're the only ones that are left really, and so they might also decide at some point that they want to leave. But until then, stay tuned for the next video. We're actually going to be looking at what if the British Empire never existed, which sounds like a very, very big topic. There's a lot of things to go through, a lot of controversies to go through, but as with all my videos, I've tried to go into a lot of detail, not necessarily trying to give my like opinion or, you know, but just letting people be aware of some of the considerations taken some of the concepts taken into consideration when discussing some of these issues, because a lot of people have inbuilt assumptions and they have their own prejudices, like either for or against, and so it's interesting and it's important, I think, to just listen to the entire kind of argument for things and to take it at face value. And when we have all the information, when we have all the facts, when we have all the data, or at least the first kind of like inklings of it, then we can make more educated choices and make better arguments, which I think hopefully is the point of this channel.